Ms. Conley?
I'm here.
Okay. Mr. Duncan?
I'm here.
All right, Ms. Hardy is here.
Yep.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
I'm here.
Mr. Snyder?
Here.
All right, I think I'm here. All right, why don't we go ahead then and reconvene and move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the new state weapons law briefing. And I don't know whether that's going to be the chief or Mr. Shields or who's going to handle that, but I think we're all looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Mayor Tarter. I'll just say a very quick word, and then I'll turn it over to Chief Gavin and to Lieutenant Dmitry Isaev. And I would like to turn it over to them because when House Bill 421 was adopted and signed by the governor this past spring, we did anticipate that the City Council would want to take action based on the authorities granted by that legislation. And I asked Chief Gavin to begin thinking ahead about that and consulting both with staff but also with members of the community with a broad range of views on these issues, just to bring some thoughtfulness and some expertise to this matter. And so what we're planning tonight is just to allow council to hear from the results of that work, and then to have a council discussion and get council direction on the ordinance that you would like us to prepare and bring back to you for your consideration. So with that introduction, Chief Gavin.
Thank you, Council. Good evening. Tonight we have we're going to propose a presentation to you that just basically introduces a framework of options of the governance of gun control measures that are allowed by the legislation. Unprecedented times in Virginia, I'd say. The General Assembly in 2020 allowed for many gun control measures within the Commonwealth, many which are supportive of red flag laws and no guns for people with protective orders, expanding background checks. But the one in particular tonight that allows for us to essentially apply community values to governing weapons is House Bill 421. As Wyatt had mentioned, we had convened a both government and community group in early spring, anticipating that council may want to move forward with an ordinance, and getting some of the opinions and recommendations from both the government and community members. We convened a group to talk through what would a framework look like to give you the best options and considerations of getting an ordinance on the book or not, as soon or you make the decision not to, up to you. So Dmitry Isaev, Lieutenant Dmitry Isaev, led this community group for the past couple of months through several, Zoom meetings, and came out with, I would dare say, a very good framework that will, one, describe the law itself, but also describe some of the measures that you need to consider in making your decision of an ordinance. Also understanding that we have our finger on the pulse of the local jurisdictions surrounding us and what they are doing. I will tell you, they are asking what we are doing. They've been asking to share our information, but I'm going to pass the baton to Dmitry, and so he can show you how the community came up with this presentation before you about the local ordinances, and here to support Dmitry and answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Chief. Good evening. I hope you can hear me.
I got you.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Welcome.
All right. Okay, let me begin by going over the request from the council to review recommendations for options regarding ordinance to prohibit the possession, carry, and transportation of firearms in buildings owned, leased, or used by the city, as well as parks, recreational or community facilities owned by the city. Virginia Code 15.2-915, as amended effective July 1, provides the opportunity for the city of Falls Church to adopt new gun control measures regarding the use and display of firearms in the city of Falls Church government property. Prior to the adoption of House Bill 421, the city of Falls Church was prohibited by Virginia law from enacting local gun control measures. Virginia Code 15.2-915 authorizes any locality by ordinance to prohibit the possession of or carrying of firearms, ammunition, components of any combination of thereof, any buildings, part thereof, owned, used by such locality for governmental purposes, any public parks owned or operated by the locality, any recreational community center or facility, public street, road, alley, sidewalk, public right-of-way, or any other place of whatever nature that is open to the public and is being used by adjacent to permit event, or an event that would otherwise require a permit. Anticipating the adoption of 421, the city manager authorized an informal working group comprising city staff and community members to discuss the legal, procedural, cultural, policy aspects of any additional gun control measures. And I'd like to list the members of the group besides myself, Police Chief Mary Gavin. We had Josh Carish, former owner of Gun Dude, Carol Luton, resident and firearms safety advocate, Jennifer Carroll, director of Public Library, Kathleen Tice, resident and elementary school PTA president, Chief Deputy Madden Kay from Falls Church Sheriff's Office. We had a guest speaker, Delegate Marcus Simon from Virginia House of Delegates, as well as Stephen Salzer, attorney firearms and self-defense law, as well as Daniel Schlitt, director of Falls Church City Recreations and Parks. This was our group, and through several meetings, we came up with a framework of recommendations which basically go from least restrictive to most restrictive. I'll go in more detail shortly. The least restrictive recommendation would suggest to make no changes to the existing ordinance and enact no new regulations. Some change, more restrictive, would restrict or ban open carry of firearms in all or some city government buildings, continue to allow concealed carry as defined by state law. Moderate change framework would restrict or ban both open carry and concealed carry of firearms in all or some government buildings. And the most restrictive would adopt the language from House Bill 421 and prohibit the possession, carrying, and transportation of any firearms in public buildings, parks, recreations, community centers, and streets events where events or rallies requiring permits are taking place. However, we do not recommend restricting ammunition, components, or combination of thereof in set places. It would unnecessarily complicate the enforcement policy and training matters. In coming up with these recommendations, we reviewed crime statistics for the last 17 years in the city of Falls Church, as well as, and I mean crime statistics involving firearms, weapons of different kinds, and violent crimes. We also reviewed policies and code of conduct of the library. We looked at the neighboring jurisdictions, what are they doing, and what are they planning to do, as well as we reviewed the police calls for service from the library. So if you'd like, I'm going to quickly go over the crime statistics for the last 17 years, and they would paint a picture of the extent of the problem that we have. Between the years of 2003 and 2020, City of Falls Church had 2 homicides, 3 attempted homicides, 9 suicides, 36 robberies. 3 times guns were fired unlawfully. There was 5 events of negligent discharge. 10 guns were stolen. There were 18 events of actual brandishing of a firearm. There were 13 events where such brandishing was reported, but was unfounded later through the course of investigation. Multiple guns were surrendered for destruction. There were 27 events in the 17 years where guns were present on the scene of the crime, but were not directly involved in commission of any crime. Other violations, such as possession, concealment, account for about approximately 8 events. In comparison, incidents involving BB guns, to include shooting of other people, injury, property damage, accounted for more than 50 events. There were 3 paintball events and 5 events, including toy or replica events. Parallel to that, at the same time, the Falls Church Public Library had 569 calls for service from the city police, and there were a total of 4 events involving weapons. We also outlined the threat matrix for all of the city buildings that would should be considered in selecting the appropriate measure. And we've discussed, for example, City Hall is open to general public. Government and court buildings and no guns are permitted in the court. The community center is open to general public and there are no restrictions in place. Library is also open to general public and has a strong educational component, and currently there are no restrictions in place. Excuse me. A police substation at the Eden Center is not a public location, is of no concern as far as gun regulations. Public works facilities have very limited public access and has no restrictions. The Gage House currently is open to general public and has no restrictions. Aurora House has no public access. It's a secure building. It poses no threat. Cherry Hill Farmhouse and Barn are open to general public and there are no gun restrictions. Central School Office located 150 South Washington Street. We need more information on that. Station 106 has some public access during events, but it is a secure building. And Farmers Market is open to general public and there are no restrictions currently. That outlines our rationale for coming up with these 4 propositions. The issue is relatively divisive and we didn't come up with a single solution, so we're going to leave that to you and we're ready for your input. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Lieutenant, for that very thorough presentation. We greatly appreciate it. So we have before us, it looks like 4 options from least restrictive to most restrictive. And what I think I'm going to do now is just open it up to comments or questions from council. And then tonight is a work session, so we wouldn't be taking action tonight, but we can discuss what action we might want to take and when. So why don't we just open it up right now to questions and comments from members of council? Does anyone have anything they would like to say?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, Mr. Snyder.
thank you very much. So I want to make a few comments and then suggest a recommendation and a way forward. You know, in recent memory, this country has seen far too many mass shootings. These have often occurred in public spaces. Just this past weekend, about 9 miles from here in Washington, D.C., 9 people shot and one fatal. The threat of gun violence is ever with us. That's the environment that we live in. And so it's for that reason that this city council, over many years, has asked the legislature for exactly the authority that they granted us in the last legislative session. It would be, in my view, less than successful in addressing the threat environment in which we exist, and would be an odd and poor response to the legislature that has finally given us the authority that we want to not fully exercise that authority. So I, for one, would support the fourth option, the most restrictive, which I think is also the most balanced and effective. And I would hope that we could move on it as early as next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other folks on council?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, Mr. Lichtenhouse.
I think somebody beat me to the punch. Who was that? All right.
Go ahead, Russ.
Okay. Just a couple points of clarification on this. Thanks to the police department for putting together this presentation. I certainly support sensible gun laws and, frankly, some of the things that should be allowed to do that are sensible. We still can't things around gun safety being one, but this particular state law that was passed, explain to me how this works on the streets piece. I get the libraries, community centers, the public venues, agree with all of that. Can someone explain to me what this means for transporting firearms on the street? Meaning if you're leaving your house or, for example, going to buy antique guns at Quinn's auction, what does it mean for, if we were to take the most restrictive, what does that mean for transporting firearms from a house to a gun range, or from Quinn's auction to a house, or from your house to the airport?
If I may, you wouldn't be able to transport it through a park, through any parking lot of a government building, or through an event such as a run, a parade, or a farmer's market. You would have to navigate around and be thoughtful and deliberate in your navigation to go around those events, and that way you will not be in violation of this proposed ordinance.
So, Officer Isaac, is it an event that's taking place at that particular time? Because we've had some folks write into us that have been opposed to this idea, stating that, for example, we have Martin Luther King Day marches on South Washington. We've got Memorial Day parades on Park Avenue. And even if we did not have an active event at that particular time, that some have interpreted the language of that statute to say that you can't use those roads because at some point they are used for public events. Is there any credence to that?
On the face value, I don't believe so. The House Bill 421 mentions the events as they're going on, at least that's my understanding and my reading. However, the ordinance, the most restrictive ordinance, would have to be carefully crafted and worded to add absolute clarity to these circumstances.
So I would ask if any proposal that we consider that is clarified, because that can be quite restrictive or concerning to some folks if they are transporting firearms. If you're going to shoot sporting clays, or again, transporting a firearm for one reason or another in your car on any street. The second question I have is, we have a lot of folks that work for the federal government here in Falls Church, some who open carry or conceal carry because of their job, some that conceal carry even though it's not required but choose to do so. And I guess that, federal, state jobs, law enforcement, or somewhat indirect. How does this apply to those individuals?
Again, it would have to be a matter of wording of an ordinance to grant permission to law enforcement, federal, state, or otherwise, to continue their duties and carry weapons.
Okay. So
Mr. Lickenhouse, this is Carol McCoskey.
Oh, hey, Carol.
I think Lieutenant Isaev is exactly correct. And I know that, for instance, in Alexandria, they've created exceptions to the prohibitions for those but carrying the weapons in the course of their duties and things like that. So there are specific exceptions that can be clarified to allow those who have to carry weapons for their work to do so.
Okay. I would ask that that's something to be considered. And if, as Mr. Snyder indicated, we want to move on this quickly because it's something we've been asking for. I would ask that we consider that. We've got, again, quite a number of folks here in the city that work for federal agencies. I don't know what their requirements are or permissions or how you define requirement to carry a firearm and how we want to deal with that. Maybe I'll just open that up to comment consideration from other council members, but again, that could be somewhat restrictive for someone who is required to carry a firearm for their job, making sure that they're able to carry on their in that capacity. But generally speaking, we shouldn't have folks with firearms inside of libraries and community centers, so I support that. But I do want to clear up some of the grayer areas, so folks feel that they can at least transport where they need to go, even if they're not carrying to a public facility or a park. And then folks that are required to carry a firearm or choose to carry a firearm, however that is defined as part of their job, and however maybe Alexandria's done it, that they still have a right to do so, and that doesn't come into conflict with our enforcement of any proposed ordinance.
All right, thank you. Other comments?
Mayor.
Yes? Go ahead, Lady.
Thank you. So I'll echo Mr. Snyder's support. I think based on all the community feedback we've heard today, we've had overwhelming support of Falls Church citizens. And I think that's the point of HB 421 is we want citizens of that jurisdiction to have a say. And this has been a long-standing request of our community. I think this is a great opportunity for us to finally live those values. I do think that it's important for us to think about the regional approach. And so given that Alexandria has moved on this, Carol, is option 4 the one that also reflects what Alexandria has done, and it looks like what Arlington is heading to do as well?
I believe so, yes. Yes, they've taken the full authority granted by the state code and enacted that with these exceptions which are added in their ordinances. I have to say I haven't seen what Arlington has authorized advertisement of, but I was told it was just like Alexandria's and parrots the code, as does Alexandria's.
And Chief, I guess from a coordination, enforcement, mutual aid perspective, does having kind of one policy across the region make sense? Or does having something different cause problems in those areas? Chief, are you still with us?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. It would certainly, I imagine, assist the Commonwealth Attorney's Office if our ordinance was parallel that with Arlington's, because we serve under the same Commonwealth Attorney's Office in courts. Alexandria, not as much, but certainly Arlington, and we haven't talked to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office on this, but we certainly can keep our with the staff in Arlington, particularly Arlington's police department and their community, keep our finger on that pulse. And I know Fairfax City asked us for everything that we had in terms of community feedback, so they're watching what we're doing. And that's all the people that we've talked to so far outside our own jurisdiction.
I do
And I
think-
have go ahead, Carol.
Sorry, I do think that in some ways, I mean, these regulations apply to conduct, to carrying guns, but to a great extent, they also are regulations of use of property. So I think there's a way in which using, applying the regulation to different property within Falls Church than it applies to within Arlington wouldn't necessarily make things confusing. But it certainly, if everybody has the same blanket law, it's very easy across the jurisdictions. I will also say, I know that Fairfax County is working on an ordinance. I spoke with the attorney who's working on it, and they have some issues related to their regulation of streets because they don't have as much control of their streets as do cities in Arlington County. And I know that Loudoun County hasn't even brought up consideration of this issue yet. Apparently, their county attorney told me that, and I think in Prince William, it's on their radar screen, but they won't be considering it till the fall.
Last question has to do around what is the, enforcement mechanism? Is it similar to Alexandria where we're recommending a class 1 misdemeanor?
Yes, that's what I've been thinking. I think there's a range that it could be a lesser penalty, but it can be up to class 1 misdemeanor. So I would assume we would want to allow for the largest penalty. It doesn't always have to get imposed in every case.
Okay, so I would support option 4 as well. I think given everything we've heard, especially from a regional perspective, and I think it's clearly reflective of what the community would like.
All right, thank you. Other folks?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, Mr. Duncan.
thank you. So appreciate the opportunity to apply the work that we've done up to now on this issue and proclamations and so forth to the brass tacks of how it really would work in our little city. I have a number of questions. It's kind of a late hour. I hate to drag everybody through every one of them, but just, let me throw out a couple that I would like a better understanding of before being asked to vote on something that is, going to have some pretty significant consequences. One, what's the difference between how council chambers, if we ever get back to it, is treated when we're in session as opposed to when the court is in session? My understanding is the court doesn't allow weapons of any kind except for law enforcement, but I believe council chambers when we're in session would allow concealed carry and open carry too. Just wonder how that changes, if it does, if we enact new measures. What effect does this have on the school situation? Our school resource officers, are they still allowed to carry if we enact some change as is being discussed here? Is there going to be a constitutional challenge to something that we do, in conjunction with our other jurisdictions? And if so, is there any litigation costs associated with that? The question about off-duty officers or those who are authorized to carry as part of their job. They're not on duty, but if they're passing through town, they stop in at 4 P's for dinner and they walk across and go through Mr. Brown's Park. Are any laws being violated there by anybody? I don't know. There's a lot of practical application questions that I have that I'd just like to know the answer to before we are asked to vote on this. The difference between concealed and open carry. I'd be comfortable, for starters, with option 2. I think it is right. That's the ban open carry. I don't see any reason for people to be brandishing and intimidating way weapons. Concealed carry folks presumably have some sort of permit and some process, and I'd for starters be comfortable with that, I think. I don't know, any of the questions that I've tossed out here, anybody have a bite on them, Carol? Litigation costs, or Mary, the right for off duties to carry whatever service weapon they have as part of their civilian life after hours. Any thoughts about any of that?
Well, I will address initially, I guess, the easy one about schools and courts, because if currently, guns are prohibited of any kind to carry into courtrooms, and the city could enact now a similar provision that would prohibit bringing guns into chambers when it's being used for a city council meeting, as opposed to for as a courtroom. The schools are governed by state laws in terms of them carrying, and that would not change. The Gun-Free Schools Act would remain and be effective in any school, and our regulations would not change that. But it would of course apply to other types of public buildings that the city controls. I also, sorry, I have now forgotten what your next question was.
That's the problem when I have a lot of questions and sorry, the hour is late. Back though to the first thing you mentioned, I mean, the difference between the courts and us, council, when we're in chambers, is the courts have, number one, they have a metal detector, right? And they also have armed, bailiffs, right? I mean,
right, and there's state law that prohibits the bringing of weapons of any kind into courtrooms.
Right, but that's...
So that's existing, and that...
In addition to that state law, you've also got the practical application of metal detector and armed, guards. So we typically don't have that in council meetings. I don't think we run a metal detector. Sometimes we do have a police presence.
If you had a law like this, you could certainly you're allowed to create enforcement mechanisms, and that could include asking people to come through a metal detector or something like that as part of your enforcement of your new ordinance.
Well, that would be something that I'd like us to talk about. I'm not sure what the appropriate setting is for us to have that discussion. I mean, we all know that there are measures in council chambers that are there to protect us up on the dais, but we don't necessarily have any extraordinary measures for anybody in attendance in the audience, or even the clerk, or the city attorney, or the city manager. So yeah, I mean, I'd like a better understanding of, right now, of course, with concealed carry allowed, some bad actor, has to give some thought to the prospect that they might meet armed, interference. If it's declared a gun-free zone, there would be less concern of that by a bad actor. At any rate, just for the safety of the public when attending council meetings, if we ever get to have live council meetings again, I'd like us to talk about, what measures we would take, what expense we would go to make sure that council chambers is as secure as it is when court is in session.
Mr. Duncan, Mary Gavin here. Back in 2004, President Bush signed a law, the Leosa law, that allowed for 2 sets of qualified officers to be able to carry their weapons throughout the United States, and that would be current law enforcement and retired law enforcement. I guess what we would need to do is get down into the specific details, because I don't have them right now, as far as the specific laws that are passed now by any state in terms of concealed carry. I don't have that answer, but that'd be something we would look into. But currently, most all retired and current law enforcement have the rights to carry their weapon throughout the United States if they're in good standing.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Like I say, this is a good discussion. Maybe everybody else knows this and I don't, but it's good to have this discussion because it's important for the public to understand, the range of missions that are out there. And we do. I agree with Ms. Hardy. We for the sake of enforcement, would like to be able to be uniform with other jurisdictions, but we need to know what we're doing first, foremost, and always, before we, just happen to do whatever our neighboring jurisdictions want us to do. I do think talking to the Commonwealth's attorney would be a good idea too, just to make sure that whatever we do is as consistent with Arlington as seems prudent for us. So I guess that leaves me. I thought, Carol, you had written something that said that this has got to be a first reading, second reading. There's a process involved for doing whatever it is we're going to do that carries into September. Did I read that in one of your memos, or am I making that up?
Well, that I think that would be correct if you read that in one of my memos, but I don't recall writing one necessarily. But it is an ordinance which would have to be passed with regular first reading, second reading, advertisement in between. And I think that would probably, given where we are at the end of July or near the end of July, that would probably get us into September.
Okay, well, I think it's important that, it's obvious what our community values are here. We all know that. I do think it's important that all people feel like they have had a chance to be heard on this issue because, as the lieutenant said, it is a divisive issue, and there's no reason for us to make it more divisive than it already is. And one avenue to do that would be to make sure that everybody feels like they've had a chance to be heard. And I, at least, was unable to open the 50 emails that came in today, most of them in the afternoon, to even read them. Most of them seem to be sort of boilerplate, but there were some individual expressions that I'd like to at least read and, have a chance to say, yes, I read what you wrote and I understand your perspective. Here's what we think we're going to do. I would hope that council would take some time to do this the right way, whatever we end up doing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Duncan. Other comments?
Mr. Mayor, I have some questions.
Please.
I think they're for Lieutenant Ilya. Earlier in your presentation, you said there were several buildings that were secure buildings, so we don't have to worry about them. One of them was Aurora House. What does that mean?
That building is not open to the general public. It's locked 24/7 with staff controlling access through a buzzer and video monitor.
But at the moment, could a family member come in with a concealed carry weapon? Or are weapons prohibited in that because it's an educational setting?
They could come in probably, but they would have to interface with the staff first, and they would have to be buzzed in. But currently, there are no metal detectors or any way of preventing a person from bringing in a concealed weapon.
Okay.
Much like about the same as a regular school.
Okay, so it's a secure building in that you can't, it's not just open access, but it's not a secure building in that there are any restrictions at the moment.
Correct.
And then you mentioned the school central office, that you need more information. Is that because it's a rental suite?
Yes. Yes, correct.
And would this, the way this is written statewide, would it cover rental areas?
Yes.
It
Yes, it would.
can be. Yes.
Yes, it would.
Okay.
Yeah, anything in terms of even meetings, if your government-run meeting in certain locations. I think you have the right to regulate that as well. Activities, government-run activities within a building.
I think that's right, so that if we had a town hall and it was located, the meeting was held in the Falls Church,
Right.
then during the time we had that, the city had that meeting there, guns would be prohibited there.
Got it, okay. But in that rented building, they would not be prohibited in the whole building, just in the parts that are related to the central office of the schools.
That's correct.
And what about stairwells and elevators? How does that work?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I'd have to look at that, and it may not be 100% clear in the statute. But we'll have to look at that, and we can certainly consider that as we, you know, as I said, there are, in most of these ordinances, there are certain exceptions for the law enforcement officers and things like that. And so I will make a note of that, and we'll consider that as we go forward.
Okay. And then, what about if someone lives on Park Avenue and the Memorial Day Parade is happening? So that street then is hosting a city event. So that person would be limited in being able to leave their house with their weapon on that day. I mean, I guess they can't drive on the street anyway, so, because the parade is going past.
That's probably true. I think they could, I think they would be restricted, although they might be able to go to a different corner or somewhere else. But I think it would be prohibited during that event from having their weapon with them as they walk down the street.
Okay. And then the other thing that Lieutenant Iliad mentioned was we would not limit ammunition or other, I can't read what the rest of that line says, but allow ammunition or something
Yes, ma'am.
else.
Our recommendation, the group's recommendation, was not to basically expand the ban to ammunition as well as components, as stated in the state code, because of the difficulty to procedurally enforce that, as well as kind of a overbroad nature of a bullet or powder casing or primer being the components of ammunition would be prohibited, but doesn't seem to be serving the spirit of the law. They by themselves aren't dangerous per se.
Okay. And Ms. McCoskey, what does Alexandria's ordinance say about ammunition and components?
I don't have an exact recollection as I sit here right now, but I believe that it was comprehensive and probably included those elements, but I will get back to you on that.
Okay, because it would make, I mean, again, it would make sense if they matched. And I understand that it's different to have ammunition to have a weapon, but again, it would make sense if our ordinances were the same.
Right. I'll check on Alexandria and Arlington's ordinances on that.
So I would agree with Mr. Snyder, if we can proceed with all due haste, I would appreciate that. I think we have been asking for this for a long time. If there are questions that aren't able to be answered in time to be able to do this next week, we should do it correctly and not rush it. But I think if we have the answers, I think we should be ready to go on first reading next week. That's all I have. Thank you. And thanks for the work for everyone that put into this.
All right, other questions or comments? Anyone who have covered everybody?
I have one request when we get a staff report together.
Yes.
I think one of the public comments we had received was around cost. So I don't see a fiscal impact associated with this yet. But I think the ordinance requires that we provide signs kind of everywhere we prohibit them. And so a rough back of the envelope kind of cost would be helpful. When I read Arlington's, I think they had a one-time cost of $100,000, which obviously they are 15 times as big as us compared to population and probably have a lot more facilities, if that's helpful for a starting point of what they approximated. Are there other costs that we need to be aware of?
The only thing I can think of, which, and I don't know that we've developed this yet really, but is other types of enforcement, anything else that the city decided to do for enforcement of this. I mean, that could be a minimal cost if we're not going to change a lot of things except keeping our eyes out, or it could be substantial if we're thinking about metal detectors or something. But that's, again, that the level that we want to go to with that would have to be considered to determine what the cost would be.
All right, are there other comments or questions? Yes, Mr. Duncan.
Carol, I didn't let you answer the question about litigation costs if this gets to be some sort of a big deal lawsuit. You don't have to answer it right now, but what are our responsibilities and what do other jurisdictions think that they would incur in terms of legal time? And second, our library, right, Mary, has an active shooter training activity that it goes through. I assume that if we're expanding the number of places that we are covering with our no-gun policy, we would want to make sure that we have the same active shooter drills in whatever facilities and locations would be applied under the new law.
Exactly. As much as we can do the first 12-minute classes, we've done it. Large portion of the schools, the Aurora House, I'd have to double check to make sure we've done that. Obviously, the library was one of our beta projects, and they have continued done updates, and Jenny is always really ahead of the curve on this. But signage is definitely something we would have to do. It would be necessary. I was just looking up Alexandria's ordinance. It does ban ammunition. And it is a class 1 misdemeanor to possess, carry, and transport firearms and ammunition in any building, park, or recreational community facility. So just to note that it is most restrictive. But we've already thought about the signs. We haven't gotten a plan or any samples for you, but that will be probably next steps based on your direction.
All right, thank you. Are there any other council comments? If not, I'll just weigh in. I do support proceeding, but I do think some questions have been raised tonight that we need to get answers as quick as we can so we can proceed because so many folks have waited so long to take action. But I do think we need to get resolution or answers to some of the questions that were raised tonight. So, but hopefully we can do that in the very near future and take action in the coming days. So unless there's anything else, why don't I thank you all for coming out, Chief and Lieutenant, for the fine work you've done to date, and we look forward to advancing this cause and passing some legislation in the very near future. So thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you. So let's move on to the last item on the agenda, which is the CARES Act budget. Is that you, Mr. Shields, or Ms. Bawa?
It will be Ms. Bawa. Just by way of introduction, however, this is really just a briefing. So given the late hour, we're going to try to keep this pretty brief tonight. What the ultimate